This tutorial will go over Photoshop's gradient tool. For this example, create a new file and set it to be, let's go for about 6 inches wide and 3 inches tall. Let's set resolution to 300 and click OK. I'm going to grab my type tool and create the word gradient and make it big and maybe choose a different type here. There we go. I like that one better. Alright, so to set up your file, do something like this where we've got a background and a word, and then create a new file, which is where we will do our gradients. The gradient tool is underneath the paint bucket tool. So if you click and hold on this paint bucket, you'll notice it's a gradient. It goes from dark to light. If you click on that, you get your gradient. Simply, if nothing is selected and you click on one side and drag to the other, you will get a gradient, and the properties of this gradient are set up here. So hit Command Z to undo that, and let's take a look at what these settings are. Click on this little bar that shows some color. This first setting, if I click on it, goes from the foreground chip to the background chip. So you can see over here my color settings, those coordinate with this. The next one is the foreground color fading to completely transparent, which is the example that I just did. These others are some presets that Photoshop has just simply come with. Now you can build your own gradient, or you can adjust a gradient that already lives here. So I'm going to show you how to do that. I'm going to pick this one to work with just because I like these colors quite a bit. Down here, these colors are set to specific color tones, and I can click on and move those to affect how much of that color will live in my gradient. And you'll notice that the transition between one color and the next is controlled by this little dot that will show up between them when you click on one. And if I click and drag it closer to one of these color points, the transition becomes much less gradual and more sharp. So you can do that. You can add a new color simply by clicking somewhere where there's not a color, and it will probably add a color for whichever the last box that you clicked on was. And you can change that color here in your color picker. I think it'll preview. That is a horrendous transition. Alright, and then click OK. So you can add color. Like I said, if you were on one color and click somewhere else, you'll add another one of that color. Once you've created a gradient that you like, you can save it up here by clicking New, and it will add this up here so you can come back and use it again and again. If you have gradients that you've made somewhere else, you can load them by clicking Load and choosing that gradient file. The transparency of a gradient is affected by these here up on the top. So if I click on one of these top chips, I can see that the opacity is at 100%, which is always represented in Photoshop by black. If it's black, it's not see-through. If it's white, it's see-through. I can change the opacity here by grabbing this and turning it down. So clear at 0 will probably not even show this last color. And I could set even more chips up here the same way I could on the bottom to affect what my gradient is going to look like. And then I could hit New if I wanted to use that one. So that's pretty much how you can edit your gradient. Let's take a look at exactly what a gradient does. So I'm going to just choose this very first one, which is my background to foreground for now, and click OK. And then I'm going to come into mine and pick some colors that are just a little bit more obvious than a black to dark blue. Alright, so my gradient layer that I'm on, if I have a solid gradient set up and click and drag, it will completely fill my layer because there was no selections made. So I'm going to hit Undo. If I make a selection and grab my gradient tool, When I click and drag, I will only fill that area that I had selected. So I'm going to hit step back by holding Command Option Z until both of those are gone. One thing to notice is that this little crosshairs that you've got, if you click and drag, it creates a line. And what that means is when I let go, that line is where the transition happens. So everything to the left of where I started to click will be solid, whatever my color on the left of that gradient range was, and same thing to the right. So if I want that gradient to be bigger, I need to make a bigger line to make it more gradual. And I'm just hitting Command Z to undo this each time. Also, the angle of the gradient depends on which way I'm going. So right now, if you click and hold Shift, it will restrain you to a perfectly straight line. And that means when you let go that the gradient you created will be perpendicular to that line that you just did. Also, you can angle to create from one corner top left down to the bottom right. There's also some other settings up here that are useful to know. Right now we're on the linear gradient, but if we click this next button, it becomes radial. So I can click and drag and it will create a circle of color. The next one, I have never really figured out a use for this. It's probably the most useless one on there as far as I can tell. I'm going to undo that. The next one transitions from front to back to front. So if I show you this, well, in this case it was the other way. Started with my back color, went to my front, and went back to the back color. These ones up here have a reverse option. So if I clicked this reverse, whatever it just did, it's going to do the opposite of that. So see, now I've got yellow as my main color, and then it transitions into the background, and then back to the yellow. I'm going to uncheck reverse. The last one is kind of a star shape, which can be interesting. And then this other setting on here is blend modes. Blend modes we haven't really touched on yet, but essentially when you create a gradient, and if I set the blend mode to something else, so say dissolve and go on top of that, dissolve's not a good example. Let's do multiply. You'll notice my colors are changing and getting darker and darker. Multiply is kind of like if you were drawing with a marker a little bit, and it would just keep layering up more and more color and getting darker and darker. And each one of these have its own quality. We'll be using these for a lot of different things during class, but this is just kind of a quick introduction. I think the weirdest one for gradient is if you choose difference and have it on this star setting and start popping some color in there, and it will take the difference of this color and do really fun things with it. And it starts becoming a little bit like a disco scene. But that's just an example of something fun you can do. I would recommend always putting it back to normal if you change this setting. The other one is opacity. So I'm just going to hide this layer and create a new one. Even though I've got my gradient set to solid foreground to background, if I change the opacity on this and click and drag, you'll be able to see through to the layer below, and it will only put down whatever this opacity is. So right now it's only got 53% of that color. And when the opacity is set down and I create a new gradient, I'll still be able to see a little bit of that old one through there. And eventually the color will just accumulate and add up to solid. So that's opacity. And that's pretty much the gradient tool. It can be quite a bit of fun.